Welcome to the 1.5 Degrees Show, a platform where we talk about anything and everything that is related to climate change and resource governance. This platform will amplify the voices of those that are disproportionately affected and make them advocate for their own rights. Why are we doing this? Because we want you, we want communities, and we want the rest of the nation to take part in this climate change discussions and discourse. Today, we are talking about just transitions. And to help us unpack this topic, we have got Mr. Chisi from Reyna Trust. Please welcome Mr. Chisi from Reyna Trust.
Thank you, Seba.
You're welcome. So maybe just to kickstart these conversations, can you tell us the basics in layman's language? What is just transitions?
In layman's language, and thank you for alluding to that, so that we make it simple for everyone to understand where we are coming from and what we are trying to talk about. Basically, the first word that we are supposed to be underscoring is the word transition. So it's basically moving from one form to the other. And within the climate change discourse and within this climate change narratives, there are so many sectors that affect climate change, and these sectors are the energy sector, agricultural land and other land use, which is called AFOLO, industry and waste. And within those sectors, there has to be a movement from a source of high greenhouse gas emissions to a point of low greenhouse gas emissions. But for that to happen, the movement has to be just. And when you're talking about just, is now to ensure that it is people-centered, it takes into cognizance the human rights-based approach, so that that movement does not then affect the very people that is trying to serve. So when we are putting together what we are calling just transitions, it means that in every sector, there has to be a transition. So when you're looking at energy sector, we're moving from fossil fuel use to renewables. If you're looking at agriculture, we are moving from using chemical fertilizers to agroecology use of organic fertilizers. When you're looking at waste management, we are looking at moving from waste to energy, or we are moving from plastics to biodegradables. Such kind of things are the transitions that we are talking about. But whilst we are doing that, we need then to understand, how do we locate women? How do we locate people with disabilities? How do we locate young people? How do we locate the economy in itself, so that at least it doesn't suffer from the choices that we would have made to move from one form to the other? So in any basic term, this is what just transitions is talking about.
Yeah. So exactly, picking up from what you are saying, I would then want to know, or maybe the rest of the people will want to know, what are the opportunities, challenges, and maybe problems that one or in any economy is likely to face when they are trying to transition into a green economy.
Let me start with the challenges that are first. One is that just transitions are supposed to be nationally committal. A nation has to commit to itself that this is the roadmap that it has begun to take. So if you look at Zimbabwe, and supposedly you want to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector, and you know very well that fossil fuels are the second largest source of our electricity. It gives us about 46% of our electricity in Zimbabwe. And when you then want to move away from fossil fuels to renewable energies, as a nation, then you need to ask yourself, so what are you going to do with the 10 point plus billion metric tons of coal that we have?
Yes.
What is going to happen to the labor that has been centered around fossil fuels?
No, thank you for that point. But Mr. Chisi, whilst you're there, let me try to bring these topics or these conversations closer to home. You are mentioning about transitioning from coal into renewable energy. But when we say we are now doing away with coal, what happens to towns like Wange, where most of their activities are surrounded or are very much related to coal? What happens to those citizens who are in that space?
Like I've said, it's called a transition. So a transition is not like an overnight change, right? It has to be staggered very well according to the dynamics that are happening on the ground. So when you come to Zimbabwe, you're not coming to Zimbabwe and say, Wange, you shut down tomorrow. And tomorrow we are already running solar panels for energy. No, that's not it. What is supposed to happen is that we need to come up with a national just transition framework, right? And a national just transition framework is the one that has to incorporate what we call the energy mix. And energy mix is basically bringing in different types of energy into one, right? So when we have got our hydroelectric that is coming from your Kariba, we've got our thermal, which is your fossil fuels coming from Wange.
Yes.
Then we have got other micro electric or energy sources that we have. They all need to be put together to go into the national grid. So what then happens is that there will not be a Wange closing down the following day, because the implication that is there is that we've got a labor force of more than 3,000, right, that depended on Wange and fossil fuels. So what are we going to do with that? The opportunities that are there is that when we move from fossil fuels into renewables, then you need to create green jobs that are required. And those people that cannot be reskilled, basically they would need to be compensated in such a way that it doesn't change their livelihoods. But also as we transit, we are not necessarily saying we stop using coal. Coal will always be in use, but in a very minimal way that will make Zimbabwe achieve its NDCs. So this is where we are. And when you want to look at the other dynamics that have got to do with issues of labor, it would also mean then that how do you do with a Sekuru who has been working in a mine dump just to collect coal? How do you reskill him to using a computer? Right. So you also need to look at just transition in an intergenerational way. So how do we deal with the children of those employees that would not then qualify in the new discourse? But also as we create green jobs are not just going to be green jobs that have to do with electricity. Green jobs are going to be diverse. So it also comes into your waste management. It comes into your water reticulation systems. It also comes into issues of agriculture. So these people's opportunities have to be taken into consideration. And Saba, remember that at some point, Wange did not exist. There was no Wange. Right, it used to be just a bush, but it had coal underneath. And people never thought that so many years later, Wange would grow so big because of coal. So we need to take that hard line to say, at some point, there was no renewable energy that could drive Zimbabwe's energy sector. But if we put our thinking down to it and put our effort, we'll definitely begin to come up with a new economy that is green.
Yes. Thank you so much for saying that. I think there is apparent need for everyone to have an understanding of what this green jobs, these transitions is all about. Maybe you can say in shortest and in the briefest of statements, what then can ordinary workers do?
Ordinary workers have to be part of this conversation, because they are the ones that are likely going to be affected, especially women, right? To say what then becomes their role as labor and organized labor, they will also need to put up their conditions to those that are supposed to be driving this kind of just transition, to say how do they fit in, how do they also begin to be part of the conversation of policy formulation post fossil fuels or during the transition that has to be in line with. And already we have got organized labor movements in Zimbabwe that already interacts with the government at the National Tripartite Negotiating Forum, right? So the government, the labor force, the private sector and business come together frequently to discuss other issues and let those issues also become part of the conversation that they need to generate. Otherwise, we might not be able to protect people who have been giving us electricity for all these years. Yes, but just the transitions, as we all know them, they are not a smooth trail, right? They might not be contextual as well. We need also to look at your geopolitics that are taking place. You also need to look at your political economy so that at least you begin to see who else is supposed to be in this. So it's not just an issue of government. It's also about other non-state actors. We also then require civil society's participation to ensure that there is monitoring, there is also tracking on how these transitions are being taken place. And because we are bound by a constitution, then there is also has to be that constitutionality in terms of how then those just transitions are implemented. This is when then civil society has to come in, but also to ensure that they amplify their voice, they build awareness to communities in terms of the choices that governments are taking.
Yeah, thank you for that. Maybe someone out there is wondering, maybe just like I am, when you're mentioning about transitioning, to me it sounds like there's a lot of technology, there's a lot of high-level skills that are required. So when we're looking within the Zimbabwean context now, looking at maybe the gap that is there within the unemployment of young people, are we saying, or what are we saying about young people? Are they trained enough to be able to contribute to this just transition movement? Because we also have to look at the element of how just transition is likely to affect the working class or the workforce or the labor force, understand? So are we equipped? Is it something that is achievable here in Zimbabwe, or is it something that is just on paper?
It is achievable. It's just the spirit of understanding that it is achievable. And for Zimbabwe, we need to celebrate the fact that we have got so many line ministries outside the Ministry of Environment that deals with issues of climate change directly. But we've got other ministries like your mines, you've got your ministries like your power and energy, you've got a ministry like agriculture. All these ministries have got a component and a very strong component on climate change, and they actually put up issues that have to deal with issues of just transitions. So when you look at the capacity that is endowed within Zimbabwe in terms of implementation, or how then the socio-economic challenges that we have at the present moment as a nation would impact in the implementation of just transitions, we need to go across to say the responsibility does not just lie with the government. The responsibility does not just lie with the executive. The responsibility goes to the communities themselves to say, you are being affected by climate change. Would you want to continue facing the same crisis for so many years to come? People are dying and people are being taken up. So you need then to say, young people, how can you organize yourselves? But for them to organize themselves, what they require first is knowledge. What they require first is climate literacy. And this is where civil society has to come in to say, how do you break down climate change? How do you break down just a transition into the layman's language, like you said in the beginning, to say, this is what is important for Zimbabwe. This is what is important for your own community, because at the end of the day, the people have to serve their community first before even they think national or even before they think global. So this is where then civil society has to come in to say, as young people as we have, what are the capacities that lie within those so-called unemployed? Because they are not just unemployed, but they are equally employed doing different things that we just don't recognize formally. But they are doing great things to serve the nation. They are also doing great things to serve the earth. If you go around and you look at young people who are in towns collecting waste, garbage, we call them Zhigunduru. No one has actually taken responsibility to recognize those young people. When we see them, we think that they are vagrants, they are beggars. We throw them into the dustbin together with our waste. But these are the young people who are serving the nation at a very large scale to ensure that we recycle our waste, but we also then create employment within the people who are totally considered as unemployed.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing up that point. I think Mr. Chisi is coming in very strongly with some very provocative thoughts, maybe that we never thought of, or maybe that we had never taken into consideration. But maybe banking off what you have highlighted, when you were talking about education, raising awareness, letting people know, is there any deliberate efforts that are there currently to make sure that my grandmother who's in the rural areas also has knowledge about what just transition is? What is the importance of social dialogue in integrating these issues of just transition within the communities?
Usually the conversations within climate change usually start at a very high level. That's the sad part. So if a conversation is not highlighted at Conference of the Parties, our COPs, right, then it usually does not have traction to come down to the community. If it was a normal way civil society does its things to say we believe in a bottom-up approach, then it would actually seem better, because then the issues are being generated at a local level, then they are interrogated at a medium level and implemented and supported at a higher level. So because that nexus does not exist, it means then that if at a global level issues of just transition are not adopted as a key resolutions to which the globe has to begin to look at, it would mean that little or no support would go to communities. But as a nation, we cannot then have to wait for the globe to decide on the future of the nation whilst people are dying. What is then required is that there has to be systems to which intergovernmental, intersectorial, or interdialogue engagements have to take place to say, how do we face our own nation? How do we save our own nation? And in this particular juncture, there are developmental organizations that have partnered with government to ensure that there is that process of climate change education and training that has to go to institutions. And those institutions then take it down to the communities. Now to sit down with Mayambuya in Bikita and start saying that what is the impact of lithium mining and its dust to your community, to your vegetation, to your agricultural produce? How then do we ensure that we can then develop opportunities from what is happening in that community so that at least their livelihoods are in better place? So it is then the responsibility of ensuring that as a society, we need to strengthen our institutions. Strengthen our institutions at a governmental level that are dealing with issues of climate change. Ensure that their capacity to deliver at the medium level of civil society and departments like your EMA, it is also equally strengthened. But allowing then those within that front to be able and to be allowed to go into the communities and build that capacity without any impediments, so that we then speak climate change not as a scientific conversation, but as an ordinary conversation that we always do within and with any other issue that we are talking about. So that is what is important, so that we then begin to ensure that climate change, it's not detached to the everyday lifestyle that communities are experiencing. But also, Seba, you need to understand that naturally, communities have always been practicing environmental conservation and protection using their indigenous knowledge systems. And we need also to acknowledge that that knowledge that has been existing within community that we call indigenous knowledge system has to be incorporated with the scientific, so that at least we are not shocking those communities by talking greenhouse gas. They don't even know what greenhouse gas is talking about. Talking about 1.5 degrees. They don't even know what degrees, those 1.5 degrees, the only degree they might know is the college degree. So you need them to simplify it into their own way of their practice. So when you talk about Cyclone Idai, for example, then the people in Chimanimani or in Chipinge will talk about Mashikiro, spirit mediums, how they are angry and how we have messed up as a people. But if you go to scientific, they will also tell you about other geological and environmental challenges that, as well as people, we might not have taken up seriously. So those are the issues that we need to.
Yeah, it's been a hot topic, and unfortunately we are running out of time. We would have loved to continue this conversation and have more conversations with you and you at home. But maybe Mr. Chisi, as we are rounding up the show, what are some, if any, key policy areas that you think or feel they need to be strengthened in Zimbabwe, so that we can ensure that the just transition in Zimbabwe, it applies to everyone, it has got social and economical benefits? What do you think we can do, or what can government do?
The most important thing is that there's no transition that can happen without the finance. And as Zimbabwe, and equally as the Global South, we have been struggling to get our share of climate finance from the Global North at global stage. And then it means that if that finance is not coming down, we need to think local and beginning to see how much of our natural resources do we have and endowed that can easily support our climate finance initiatives, but also using the knowledge that we have, how can we also fundraise for such kind of support, so that at least we don't continue to overburden communities. And when it comes to issues of climate finance, we are saying, as Zimbabwe, as the Global South, we are not responsible for the climate disasters that we are currently faced with. Those people who are responsible, who are in the developed country, they need to, without shame and without any excuse and with no apology, send down that money to Global South countries like Zimbabwe, so that Zimbabwe will be able to build its capacity for adaptation, its capacity for mitigation. So what then it means, Saba, is that at that point, it's then when the government and all the other non-state actors have to come together and build a strong advocacy to ensure that those funds trickle down to Zimbabwe. And the second thing that has to happen is that for that to happen as well, it means then we need to look at critical policy pronouncements that are in existence to say by 2030, Zimbabwe committed to have cut its greenhouse gases by at least 40% per capita, right? But then it put a condition to it to say, for this to happen, it's all conditional. Unless we get money from the global north, that implementation of nationally determined contributions is not going to happen.
Exactly.
But then we cannot be that naive to wait for money that we know will never come. When we know that every other year, people are being affected by cyclones. Every other year, people are being affected by droughts. Every other year, people are being affected by heat waves. So we also then need to strengthen our own non-state actors' driving force to ensure that we buttress local demands. To say, government, this is your responsibility. Outside what the North is saying, you have got a primary responsibility to save your own nation. And this is what is supposed to happen. Then the last thing is that, like we have said, climate change is not a common conversation. How do we build and amplify that language? How do we simplify it? I would want to see Mukadota talking about climate change. Right? Not just Mukadota talking about Mairwiz. We need now to have spaces where we talk about these critical issues in a very simplified way that allows people then to adapt and then get into advocacy initiatives and engage with all the other stakeholders, including communal leadership and even national leadership at the end of the day. So this is a living experience that all of us, we need to come together and support each other. There are platforms, there are days, there are commemorations that are being taken care of at a national level and at a global level that have got a relationship to environment and to climate. Let organizations find themselves building synergies around that and ask ourselves, what have we gained? What have we lost? What are the opportunities that are in existence? And I'm sure that Zimbabwe will be a better place.
Right, there you have it. You have heard it from Mr. Sydney Chisi. There is need for us all to have a common sense of what we can do to contribute towards climate change as a whole and this just transition. As you have heard him, he was speaking about the need for a top to bottom and a bottom to top approach where we discuss these issues. And we are so thankful there are spaces and organizations like Reyna Trust who are using theater, radio dramas and other art forms to engage these communities at low level on these two technocratic and scientific discourses in climate change. So it's time for us to part ways right now, but don't worry, we've got you. Next week we'll be back again with another hot topic. So be sure you tune into our channel and make sure you set a reminder for next show's episode. You don't want to miss it. Bye for now.